The Survivors, Chapter 5, The Aftermath. The fuel cell consists of two portions of electrodes separated by an electrolyte. Gas is fed into one electrode and air or oxygen into the other, with the resulting oxidation creating electricity. Thermoelectricity by Carl Lawrence. The fuel cell conversion ration for the magnet chopper, often referred to as a flying saucer, due to its shape and the fact that it is dual prop opposition rotors mounted below the control cab, required no tail prop, was 82.63%. The rotors themselves was turned by a special small electrical motor directly powered by 20 fuel cells in a series. The fuel cells were stacked 2 high and 2 cells wide, with a 5-cell depth, and each cell measured on each foot, 1 foot in height and 1 foot in length and 1 foot in depth. The Magnet 3 rode easily above the new boom city of Pexi, outside of the crude oil and major refinery and transportation point for northern Brazil's gas and oil. Pexi also boasts the first practical and general usage magnetohydrodynamic converter. It was now the sole MHD converter in existence. General Murdoch and General Hernandez viewed by the converter and the city together, discussing plans for the future. Rio and Sao Paulo had been destroyed, as had Montevideo and the port city, along with Bogota and Buenos Aires. Radiation and bacteria had struck, leaving many cities with minimum population. But the boon city of Pexi and the capital, Brasilia, had survived. Due to the placement of the OAS forces and the serums, it was a tough fight, but now, after 1 full month, the death rate was down to 5 per day, and the trade winds had been merciful. The 1969 Z Observer satellite had broadcast the North American and European scenes. The concept of life in that part of Earth seemed impossible. The Soviet Union and Red China were much the same. A small body of perhaps 100 troops and mobile equipment had been spotted moving across the tundra. One thing did upset General Murdoch: the sight of a red Chinese ship, perhaps a troop carrier, moving across the Pacific Ocean toward the fugal tip of South America. Murdoch did not know that they were bound for South America or Antarctica, but he notified Little America of their approach. Murdoch ordered the pilot to land the Magnet near the OAS command center. The radio man would be expecting him to try to reach Moonbase 1 again. Murdoch knew it was hopeless. The radiation played havoc with radio communications. The weather was funny too. Much cooler now, Murdoch thought, while Antarctica was warmer. In the submerged warfare, the Seaweed and her sister ship, the Sea Hunt, had survived. They now sat quietly at Security Base 2, commanded by Admiral Anthony Tony the Torpedo Calloway at Isle Masatiara. Commander Stanton, commander of the Seaweed, was gazing out of the porthole-like window as Calloway summarized the conditions. Well, and that's how it stands, Calloway was saying. We survived. Technically speaking, we won the war. Base 3 has been destroyed, Base 1 is inoperative, and one surviving submarine, the Squid. They're on their way here now. There is an OAS Survival Command Center near Pixie, Brazil, which will be our final destination. Was this war necessary? Stanton asked. Calloway shrugged. I don't know, Bill. It's one of those stupid things. We've been prepared for it for years. Finally realized that sooner or later it would be inevitable, like the common cold. Our guys even figured out that the Red Chinese would start it, though we weren't sure how. We couldn't get Russia to operate and neutralize the Red Chinese permanently, so we had to go it alone. Once it started, of course, we knew we couldn't trust either China or Russia, so we destroyed them. Until now, there were too many people and too many nations to have war to end all wars. Now, we've had it. That's rather callous, Stanton said. Yes, it is, but it was just being realistic. We could control ourselves, but we couldn't control them. Russia felt the same way. The Red Chinese government didn't care. With their population and faced with the fact that people were oppressed to the point of rebellion, they had to do something, and they did. Fire, famine, and pestilence, the very essence of war. Red China had them all. You mean they expected it to happen? Yes. They had many ideas, decentralized cities and so forth. Somebody recalled that back in the 60s there'd been an idea for an anti-missile missile that never got off the ground because of politics, costs, and technology. There was a secret crash program to develop one, but it was a bit too late, it seems. They didn't do anything to try and prevent it? He asked. We've been trying for years, Bill, for years. But the Russians abandoned the teleprinters and the hotline. They were more centralized than we were. Like us, they figured that once it started, there would be no stopping it. As a result, we blew up the world. Not pleasant, but there it is. Stanton nodded and looked as if he aged 10 years in 1 month. By the way, the Sea Hunt is still armed. They took on 5 survivors from a B-70, apparently the last plane to go down, as far as military bombers go. Doc gave the crew 50-50 chance. You know how it is. Let's say I have a hunch. I know how it is, Stanton said coolly. Was it president? I don't think so. We're not sure exactly how many survived. We think several hundred made chance. Small chance. Yes, Stanton said slowly, a small chance. He turned to look out the porthole. Just offshore, the submarine Squid surfaced. Stanton turned to follow Admiral Calloway out the door. The 3 men of the Green Beret moved sluggishly north and west, no east. Their minds were foggy. Exhaustions overtook them, but they plunged onward, carrying the helium bottles and inflatable boat. They'd entered through Kabul, Afghanistan, across the mountains and the hunger steppe across Kazakhstan. Now 3 men with a boat and no idea to move across the corner of the Alaya Mountains. The survival kit had included the radiation serum as well as other drugs, enough for the entire crew. There was no problem. Nor was there any forcible opposition. Radiation and plague had cleared the way. The town near the mouth of the Selenga was empty. It had not been hit by a bomb, but the streets were filled with skeletons. A dog with ribs showing, skidded across the buildings. Adams, now in command, killed the dog with one shot. Later they roasted it on the outskirts of the town. The meat was stringy and coarse, but it was something to eat. Later, as they paddled down the Selenga toward Lake Baikal, Jennings shot 3 wolves and a rabbit. What did they not eat, they saved. There was another ghost town, as was Ulam Udi. They started to cross the Ike when Adams called a halt. Looked like Irkutsk's been hit. Probably too hot there. Let's turn north. Find a pass through the Bekaa Mountains to the Lena. Probably some rapids, but I think we can make it. 2 days later, on the other side of the mountains, Jennings shot another wolf. The rest of the pack scattered as they picked up Jennings' kill and launched the rubber boat. It was a wild trip at first. There were rapids, which they simply rode, not caring. There was another ghost town, and then another. The latter had been hit by a small bomb, and the radiation dose meter indicated low radiation level. They passed it by, quickly taking additional shots of serum. At the mouth of the Olikma, where it flows into the Lena, was a ghost town of Oligminski. It was a difficult choice, but finally Adams said, up the Olicum. The passage became more difficult. Jennings shot a bear and 2 more wolves, which they carried in spite of forages and porches around rapids. The final portage carried them to the Alder, and then another boat ride. This time with the current past Alden, another ghost town. They turned up the Maya River toward Nilkan, and then days later they reached Nilkan. They abandoned the rubber boat and some of their gear. They also ate the last of the meat. From here, across the corner of the Stanovoy Mountains, Adams said, to the coastal town of Ayayan. And then, what then? Smith asked. He coughed violently. Then, if we're lucky, perhaps there'll be a fishing shack and a free ride across the sea of Okhotsk around Kamchutka Peninsula to a small base on Atu on the end of the Aleutian chain, which I hope is still there. If we're lucky, Jennings said softly. He aimed the rifle and fired 3 times. There were 3 more wolves to eat. Seems as if they're coming out of the wilderness for revenge on humanity. That's a cryptic outlook, Jennings, Adams responded, but still, it's the truth. Think they knew this war was coming off? Looks like it. Guess that's why they sent us in. The quote, investigation, unquote, was for show. Maybe, yeah, I suppose you got a reason at that. Well, let's gather up the carcasses and get moving. The forest and desolation remained. Here and there among the trees and the plains were signs of death, the withering of foliage and a burnt look. Weather should be colder, much colder, Adams muttered. Adams nodded. It should have been, but it wasn't. Later, as they crossed the crest of a hill, Jennings drew their attention to the next valley. Look at that. Below them, across an broad but desolate valley of waste, was a gorge, a gigantic crack in the earth. Some bombs must have hit a fault line, Adams said softly. Anchorage, perhaps, but clear over here. Who knows? We're near the sea. And remember, the Great Wall of China was plagued by quakes a few thousand years ago. Little did they realize that at that time that Alaska was now a land of volcanoes. Every volcano in Alaska, even those considered dormant, was erupting, as well as several new ones. The mountains had sunk over 3,000 feet, and Kuta, an island in the Aleutian chain, had disappeared entirely. The Alaska Peninsula was now an island, as was the Kenai Peninsula, the Siberian Chukotski Peninsula. Kamchatka was now an island also, and half of Japan had slipped below sea, while the other half was blanketed by radiation and bomb craters. Okinawa had been blown off the map, literally. Iwo Jima and all the volcanic islands were now active volcanoes. Ayayan had not been hit by nuclear bombs. Something had landed near the center of town, although perhaps it was a missile. There were rotting corpses everywhere. Apparently, the scavengers had not yet arrived here. Jennings shot 5 wolves and a bear, type undermined, which they had consumed with relish. Having had no food for the last 36 hours, most of the fishing goats, or at least those they found, were fishing boats were unseaworthy, having been run around or having lost their mooring. In a little inlet, however, they found the Russian version of a PT boat, which they immediately commanded. "Well, it's usable," Adams said after a brief inspection. "Let's store the meat and get out to sea." Smith had stopped the violent coughing. He had a chance. From the village, the ground of gunfire ripped the silence. "Jennings found another wolf," Smith said, loading the meat. 10 minutes later, Jennings returned, dragging a large black buck behind him. "Deer for a change," Jennings said proudly. "I also get these 3 rabbits, sickly looking, but they'll do." They crossed the sea at full speed through the Kurile Islands chain, or what remained of it, and turned north by northeast toward Attu. The remains of Attu Island glowed like a bright light, like the sun, like a live coal on a black sea. "Where to now?" Jennings said softly. "South, I guess," Adams said softly. "Across the wide Pacific. I doubt anything of significance remains in Alaska, Canada, or the U.S., and the radiation level is a bit up." "Sir," Smith coughed twice, "there is one base. The Ruskies might not have it. There's a small island in Norton Sound on the south side near St. Michael's, a small secret base for some secret tests, weather or gravity, I guess. They have serum and everything, and they may have survived. It's a possibility." Well, time had no meaning. They had survived, and that was important. It was he, the sole factor. James and Cindy Sanders had survived. Dr. George Wilson, his wife Maria, and their 5 children had survived. The earthquakes had destroyed the home he built, and the radiation level in the little canyon off the Magdalena River Valley was rising slowly but steadily. And so George Wilson, now old and ailing, guided them across the mountains pass to the river which had led to the Amazon. George Wilson died shortly before his wife did, by some 3 days, of an unknown illness. They were buried on the Columbia side of the Putumayo River, leaving 3 sons and 2 daughters, Sam, age 22, George Jr., age 20, Marta, age 19, Anna, age 18, and Steve, age 17. They were accompanied by James Sanders, age 24, and his wife Cindy, aged 20. James Sanders did not like having to carry the heavy load of equipment, but he knew Sam and George Jr. did, because they had received their scientific training from their father, and he knew the value of the equipment which they lunged across the mountains. The donkeys were finished, but the riverboat, which for some unknown reason had been abandoned there, would serve. It did, and after a long trip, they reached the Amazon. Carlsbad Caverns had collapsed during the quake, and that much the president knew. Almost 1,000 people had been killed. Volcanic fault, and over 300 people had perished before the lava flow had been blocked by a cave-in. The West Coast enclaves had suffered. The Oregon-Washington enclave was an anarchy. The Southern California enclave had been crushed with an earthquake and cave-in. An unknown disease had killed 200 in the Iowa's enclave. One by one, the lights were going out. But still, some listened. Still, some had hope. Perhaps they could tunnel their way out of the U.S. and out of the high radiation. Perhaps a tunnel to central Mexico. Thus the survivors, 918 adults and 1,900 children, gathered at the Texas enclave. The enclaves had suffered the cramped, claustrophobic feeling on top of the thermonuclear hysteria had destroyed law and order. They waited like rats in a trap. Death swept in from a dozen directions. An electrical cart from the Texas enclave to the Rio Grande enclave just across the Mexican border shorted. A panic rippled through the passengers as they sipped off the electric carts, and within the 10 minutes, 59 children were trampled to death. The president left the Texas enclave with the CIA chief Hansen at 12:45. Behind them, from the remaining 600 workmen, brought the last of the technical equipment. We received a message from our base of Norton, in Norton Sound, Hansen was saying. Seems like 2 of the Green Beret got out of the Gobi. There was a 3rd Smith who died at sea. Only 5 men left at Norton, plus 2 women. Sea Hunt is on his way there and should pick him up by tomorrow. The president nodded. I think we'd better. His words were cut off by a tremendous roar. A flash of bright light and billowing clouds of dust. The electric cart jumped off the floor. Hansen screamed as the cart fell on top of him. Sam! Sam! The president shouted, picking himself up, ignoring the bruises. Sam Houston was dead. The enclave, a pile of rocks and debris, blocked the passage. 600 men had died. So, perhaps by the time the president and the driver reached the Rio Grande enclave, the doctor had more bad news. I'm afraid, Mr. President, that this disease is beyond what drugs I do have. 5 have died so far, perhaps 100 more by this time tomorrow, and the Negroes have been complaining again. Again? What the hell do they want? Equal housing? The president laughed. Ambassador Murphy squinted out of his slit across the black and white snow field, and the little figures started again. In his hands he held the machine gun firmly, and in front of the slit lay 203 bodies to attest to his accuracy. To his left, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sat quietly waiting. Beyond him, another young man solemnly spoke over the radio, reporting the fighting to the OAS Survival Center. They were Chinese. They had arrived under flag of truce, but the flag of truce was nothing more than a trick. They killed the post commander and 5 aides. Now, as far as Ambassador Murphy knew, 5 men had survived. He was one of those 5. Murphy shrugged and grimmed. Across the snow, 500 Chinese advanced. Their attack started the final assault with a mortar barrage. General Murdoch read the 25-page report from Antarctica shortly after he finished the 53-page report from Norton Sound and the 18-page report from the President of the United States. But he sent an F-105 to Antarctica to find and destroy the enemy. The 105 had made a suicide dive on the ship, but had exploded in mid-air before he could hit it. A report from General Stanton at Security Base 2, Admiral Calloway was dying. Murdoch glanced again, so Commander Stanton Murdoch yawned. "Radio man," his voice echoed strangely. "Yes, sir," the radio man answered, entering the room with a pen and pencil. "Take a message to General Commander and Stanton, USS Seaweed. Message. Leave dock with Calloway. Urgent you proceed. Full speed to Little America. Chicoms have attached under white flag. I'm afraid the war isn't over for them. F-105 and Ambassador Murphy have already given their all." Signed Murdoch, OAS. 5 Negroes had died in the riot, if it could be called a riot. They'd been beaten to death after 2 of them raped a young white girl, aged 10. The whites had then their revenge on a Negro woman before order was restored. 2 hours later, the woman died. The doctor could not determine how many times she had been raped. The President of the United States dried his eyes. Race riots were not exactly new. In fact, they were old-fashioned. His sanity completely vanished. There were now less than 1,000 adults left and perhaps 700 children under his care. There was no real order. There were 5 overworked doctors and 3 nurses to care for over 1,000 people who were suffering from everything from radiation poisoning to beriberi. The last of the fuel cell power packs gave out and the laser beam was put out of action. Someone discovered a set of shovels and they began to dig. They formed bucket brigades to carry it. An hour later there was another landslide, and perhaps 100 more persons were buried. Pressure is a wonderful thing to work under. By careful calculation, the Sea determined where the Chinese destroyer was located, according to the OAS report. After several exciting calculations, MacDonald reset the Polaris and fired it. 2 hours later, the Seaweed, under the command of Commander Stanton, reported that they sighted the Chinese destroyer, badly damaged, and were moving in for the kill. It was the last report received from the Seaweed. Calloway was talking to General Murdoch on the radiophone when he spotted the destroyer lying off Security 2. Murdoch, too, told him this was a new one and that he'd have 1969Z take a look at it. But then it was too late. The squid and security base were to return to ashes. Adams gazed at the Christmas tree. The lights, which were the heart of a nuclear-powered Polaris missile submarine. Jennings and McDonald, the commander of the sub, stood beside him. There are 2 destroyers now. One just blew up, Security 2, and the Squid Murdoch is looking for it with the 1969-Z. Once he tells me where it is. What about the other one? Still no report. I've got orders for full steam ahead for OAS Center. They want some atomic missiles to protect them. So the war isn't over. No, the bloody idiots. What the hell do they want? By the time they get done, they won't have anybody left alive. Maybe that's the idea. Maybe they're a bunch of nihilists, Jennings commented with a shrug, and then lapsed back into his familiar silence. McDonald shook his head. Probably bad communication. Yeah, probably bad communications. They think those guys from Peking made it. Never figured out a handful of Green Berets wiping out the elite. And if the elite survive, they'd better carry out their, quote, duty, unquote, before the elite decide to delete them. Adams nodded in agreement. Seems reasonable. Message, sir. There was a flat statement revealing nothing. There was weight in McDonald's voice, though. From OAS, the seaweed got the destroyer, and the destroyer got the seaweed. They went down together. No survivors from the seaweed or the destroyer or Little America, and the second destroyer is still off the Brazilian coast. Polaris missiles? Jennings asked. Yes, but not just one this time. We won't make that mistake again. 3 of them. 2 missiles each. Okay. 6 megatons did a lot of damage. They also set off a small shock wave on the ocean floor, triggering a mighty quake in Central America. And 50 feet beneath the surface, near the Rio Grande, approximately 50 men were buried. After the cave-in, their bodies were recovered, principally for the shovels which they had. The President of the United States had aged. His aging had nothing to do with the years, the strain, the pressure, and the toil held heavily onto him. No longer was a prim and proper gentleman. His face was smeared with dirt. His face was covered with a 2-day growth of beard. His suit was a dirty white shirt and overalls, and his refined mane of hair was now an unruly gray mess. Men had died in the tunnels, in one horror after another. They died in cave-ins, some had gone crazy and being killed in turn. There had been riots and revolts. The 10 Secret Service agents assigned to cover him had given their all. Now it did not matter to him. His body was weak, and he was sure of if it would withstand the torments to follow. But still, he labored on, and now he was a guiding light, an example for people to follow. And only his undying spirit and unending zeal held them together. His doctor was now a small-time MD who formerly done only general practicing in a small town in Illinois. The radiation expert was a private third class. They had dug approximately 150 miles into Mexico before it was safe for them to surface, but at long last, 692 tired adults and 125 tired children under 18 emerged into the light of day. They had survived. The president laughed until he wept. They had made it. Exhausted, he laid down on the ground, rolled over, and looked up at the blue sky, the fleecy white clouds, and the glorious blazing sun. A predecessor of mine once noted, he stopped for a breath of fresh air, that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one single step. We have taken but 2 of those steps, but we shall go on. Those first 2 have undoubtedly been the most difficult, but we cannot slacken now. We must go on. Approximately 20 people heard him say those words which would become immortal. 7 of those 20 made note of it or wrote them down. They were the last words he would ever speak. The great heart rested, and he slept quietly away as if sleeping. Then on this one of the unnamed brown hills of Mexico, an unknown and unmarked grave, the President of the United States was laid to rest. He had given his all. The President is dead. Long live the President of the United States. And they elected Private Third Class Alan Davidson as President of the United States, a president, and they moved on toward South America. The damn destroyer is still afloat, McDonald stamped, crushing the paper that had brought the message. Apparently severely damaged and afire, but still afloat. Well, one more missile can't hurt. What I can't understand is how could they survive a nuclear explosion at all? Perhaps the missile radar gear isn't locking in on the target. No, that isn't the problem, Jennings said. Thing is that, well, okay, we're shooting at a fixed position, and the ship is a moving target. The target is damaged. It won't be going far in 20 minutes. Let's get a new fix on it. And the 4th missile was dead center. There was no more destroyers, and the Sea Hint headed for OAS base full speed. General Murdoch and General Hernandez had their work cut out for them. In the jungles, the natives were dying by the hundreds from the poisonous radiation which fell from the clouds like invisible rain. Yet over 5,000 persons had reached the reproductive serum, which was the only immunity to the death-dealing invisible rays. 5,000 would survive. Of that, they were sure. Thousands more would perish from radiation from the strange bacterial forms carried by the wind into South America. Newborn infants suffered a high mortality rate, which was estimated at 1.9 per union. The birth rate of infants who would survive. At this rate, the population would slowly be depleted, as 2 per union would be necessary to maintain the present level of population. Another uncomfortable fact was that there were more men than women in a ratio of 4 to 1. To this was added the fact that 1 out of 2 of the men was sterile. The sterility factor among women was almost negligible, since it had been one of the prime elements of research. In men, however, the research had shown a 50% efficiency. This area of the serum's ability had been under intensive research. as of late, but no satisfactory results had been obtained as far as an improvement. It should be explained, perhaps, that the radiation syrup actually involved not just one antibiotic pill, but an entire series of inoculations and drugs, which largely affected the reproduction of cells, antibodies, and white corpuscles. In effect, it would speed up skin cell growth so that the radiation-affected cells would flake off. Bone tissue was likewise affected, as was the blood, producing an increased rate of perspiration and defecation. In a woman, a normal menstrual period of 30 days was reduced to hours. While hardly enjoyable, it was possible to live, and thus the uncomfortable results were merely to be tolerated. It might be further noted that these drugs were administered in equivalent dosages in regard to the size of the individual, not the amount of radiation the persons received. The radiation would activate the various drugs so that they would operate in the affected areas like antibiotics. But the radiation serum had its limitations. An inefficient amount or missing a proper inoculation period could be dangerous. 5 men went blind as a result, the eye being one of the most sensitive areas to become permanently deformed, and 10 had to undergo minor operations for skin-sensitive areas and skin burns. The 10 had to undergo minor operations for skin burns. Thus, 2 months had passed and the population of the planet stood at 6,198. Contact had been made with the moon base, but the survival situation on the moon, which relied on supplies from Earth, was becoming dangerous.